Hi everyone, welcome. I'm on my way over to these two bins of European night crawlers. 13 days have passed since we last checked in on these little guys, and I'm sure they're ready for some food. So I'm going to slip on a glove, we're going to get them up on the bench and get them fed. So let's get to work. As you can see, there's a pretty wide assortment of different things I've got set aside here for them. Here's a big pile of assorted veggies, sort of frozen into a block. I'll have to break that apart. I've got a couple banana peels as well as some asparagus. And this stuff came out of the freezer a little while ago, so it's been thawing a little bit. Most of it's frozen still. So we'll probably lay down some nice bedding beneath wherever we end up putting it, just to make sure the wormies don't get directly exposed to the frozen materials. Not that I think it would be the end of the world, but still seems like the polite thing to do. I don't know if there's any worms on here. I thought I might have seen one or two, but just to play it safe, I'm folding it in half so they don't get that sense that a whole bunch of dry air is hitting them. Last time we sprinkled a whole bunch of leafy material out across the top, and I've also got my box of leaves here with which we can do the same again today. And I've also got a couple sheets of paper, which I believe the worms also enjoy hanging out on and nibbling. So I thought we would give them not only a refreshed top covering of leaves at the end, but we would also maybe throw a piece of newspaper across the top. I've also got my prepared bedding, and that's what we'll use as the foundation for today's feeding. We could also recycle some of this nice worked leafy material to include in the feeding as well. Out here on the surface, it looks like it's already gotten a good bit of attention here, getting nibbled away and remaining nice and damp by being underneath the plastic where all the moisture recirculates. So I took a quick glimpse at the video from last check-in 13 days ago. Like I said, 13 days ago since the last check-in. That was feeding number 11. This will be feeding number 12. And as far as the population of these two systems, they're both the same age, 137 days of age, both launched on the same day. However, there was a point in time where bin number 2 received a few extra worms. I think it was like a cocoon nursery, or there was some extra worms piling up at the end. And then bin number 1, this bin, had some weird mold growing on it. So we decided to put those extra worms into the other system, not knowing what the real deal in here was. And I think the overwhelming consensus from almost all the viewers in the comments was that that mold was just fine, and that the worms would probably enjoy eating it. I think I even started seeing some of the same mold develop in bin number 2 later, which I did feed to the worms, but the mold that I spotted growing in here was removed, and I took it outside. I didn't know what to make of it. In the end, it seemed like I probably should have held on to it and given it to the worms. But I don't know, I was just being overly cautious, I guess, just not knowing what it was. I wanted to play it safe. It just had this unusual appearance to it, so I don't want to take any chances. I'll tell you, the moisture levels in here are pretty good, meaning they're high. And I guess, I don't know, how do you know if it's good or bad? I guess it's good from the worms' perspective because they love moisture. I guess if I was looking to harvest the castings in here, I might not see it as being such a good thing, because I would find the material to be perhaps a little too muddy and clumpy to be easily handled and managed. But since I'm not really in here for that purpose, I'm not objecting to the fact that there's a good bit of moisture in here. I think that'll just help with the breakdown of the materials and keep the worms happy. So I've seen no signs of the pumpkin or the cauliflower stems and leaves that what they were fed last time. The only stuff I've bumped into so far, as far as leftover foods, are these corn cobs that I've been piling up. And I can't even tell you how long they've been in here. Corn cobs just take a while, and we'll continue to see them. I suppose I could just break them up. Once they get to a certain point, they're pretty fragile and they crumble pretty easily. So it wouldn't be too tough to break them into smaller pieces, probably making it difficult to identify them as corn cobs later, probably helping to accelerate their breakdown process. But I don't know. I just prefer to leave things intact and let the process break them down, usually. I'm in no hurry. It's just more interesting, I think, to see how the worms manage with this stuff over time. Okay, I think we've made ourselves a pretty decent sized hole down here. I'm still kind of bumping into things that I believe are here. For example, is a little piece of corn cob that was fractured in the previous check-in. So I'm still sort of encountering little bits of leftover food. But like I said, nothing from the last feeding as far as I can tell. Mainly corn cobs, and who knows how far back you gotta go to the point in time when they were fed. Now I've got my prepared bedding here. I whipped up this batch a number of days ago, so let's not implant any little worms in here as we reach in to grab a handful of this stuff. There was a little bit remaining, and I tried to isolate that stuff on this edge so that when we came back in here to grab some, we would get some of the more seasoned, aged material. So we'll grab at it from this edge. And those are two pretty generous handfuls of bedding, you got to admit. Look at all that. They're going to love that. And then not to mention a fairly generous portion of fresh bedding getting added. We've also got this stuff, this recycled leafy material off the top surface we thought would be a nice material to include as bedding down here too. And I guess before we drop in today's feeding, we could also restore some of these leftover bits. I don't know, this is the part where I start to question the order of doing things. These things do have wormies hanging out on them. And I guess if they're, yeah, you know what, let's do that. Because if they don't like the cold material coming in on top of them, they can just dive down, which I guess would be their natural impulse anyway. As opposed to, you know, placing these things right on top of a bunch of frozen stuff. If they try to escape, they'll climb off the foods into a much colder environment. And this way, at least, that they do want to get away from the stuff, they can. Just try diving down into the fresh bedding materials. Okay. I'm just looking at the two sides here where we stacked up some material. I'm just questioning whether I'm going to have enough stuff at the end to cover up with. I think when we examine the outer edges of the system, we're going to be able to kind of till up the material and fluff it up a little bit, so it should oh, let's go. It's still frozen together. We should be able to kind of, you know, fluff it up and increase its overall volume by doing so. Hopefully enabling us to cover up the foods. Luckily, we're now into the I think the later stages of autumn. There might be another month or so of autumn remaining before we roll right into full-blown winter. And I guess with the cooler temperatures, okay, with the cooler temperatures come, I guess, fewer flying insects, or so it seems. I don't see any lately in my worm bins, which is kind of nice. I guess it's for that reason I've not been concerning myself too much with the application of the Mosquito Dunks BTI solution. That's usually my primary countermeasure for dealing with the flying insects that sometimes make themselves at home in my worm bins. And the stuff works great, but I've not really seen too much of a need for it lately. So before we cover up the foods, I'm going to sprinkle in a little bit of this crushed eggshell, which will just help the worms break the materials that they're eating down. You know, we classify that as grit in the worm bins. And just like birds, the worms have gizzards, and it'll just help them with the breakdown of the foods that they're consuming by having grit down in their gizzards to aid in the digestion process. So I guess I'm just sort of taking some of this looser stuff that was out on the surface with which to cover up. But before we level everything off and cover up for good with all the top covering, stuff. Let's just take a peek at how things are looking out here. I guess with the fairly high degree of moisture in here, I do worry sometimes about the material getting a little bit too muddy, and I don't know, when it seems to get too muddy and all clumped together, to me it seems like the worms are not able to pass through this stuff. Although I might just be, you know, thinking that as like a figment of my imagination. I guess it depends on the material, but in general I like for the material to be kind of flaky and loose, hopefully enabling the worms to pass through it unobstructed. So yeah, that was kind of nice to be able to break that stuff up a little bit and loosen it up, as opposed to allowing it to remain all clumped together and muddy. We'll do the same over here. I'm not going to worry too much about what appears to be perhaps a little bit more moisture in the system than is needed. You can see that the worms are really digging it. They're pretty much throughout this stuff. They're not just down in the middle where the feedings have been getting applied, but they're out here in these outer edges in good numbers. They're all over the place. You might have remembered from what I showed earlier, the worm count, or at least the estimated worm count for this system, is in the neighborhood of about 2,500 worms. They say about a pound of worms equals 1,000 as far as their count. So if that's true, there's probably about 2.5 pounds of European night crawlers living in here. Or at least when we started the bin, it could possibly be more, because it is the tendency of the worms to mate and increase their head count. So I think we've got a pretty good leveled off space here that we could begin covering up. Yeah, I like the way things look in here. And I'm glad we had a chance to sort of, you know, break up some of that material out on the outer edges, because it did seem a little bit overly damp, if you ask me. And that bedding that we placed down underneath the feeding, it was moistened, but maybe it'll possibly, I don't know, maybe it'll attract a little bit of the moisture from the surrounding areas into itself. And I guess that might be the other benefit to this dry leafy material we're placing out here too, that it might also collect up some of the moisture that's in the system. Because once we put the plastic coverings on here, any moisture in the system will attempt to escape through evaporation, and the plastic will just keep it down within the system. And as it recirculates, it'll dampen all these dry materials, possibly enabling us to have a slightly less damp system the next time. And I guess whenever that next time will be is unknown. We did give them a pretty generous feeding with a lot of bedding, so we might be able to wait another couple weeks like we did this time. So let's get the other bin out here and feed them. Yeah, so this is the one where we think there might be a couple hundred more worms in here, but it's always so difficult to tell. It's really just estimated worm counts that I collect from the viewers at the time of the launch and at the time of worms being added. I'm getting myself all dirty here. But since we managed both systems pretty much identically over their lifetimes, with the exception of possibly adding a few extra worms into this one, it's fair to say that we're probably going to encounter very similar situations in here as we saw in the first one. When I'm doing bins like this that are sort of like sister bins or twin bins or buddy bins or whatever you want to call them, I use all those expressions sort of interchangeably. I feel like exploring the first one is sort of a trial run, and once I get to the next one or any other one that is subsequently being checked on, which should theoretically be almost identical to it, the first one that is, I feel like I can sort of breeze through the second or third or next feeding, because I feel like I've already sort of gone through a dry run or sort of a rehearsal of what to expect. So even though we took a little bit of extra time to get the first system fed, we might be able to take care of getting this one fed a little bit more quickly, unless of course we encounter something out of the ordinary or weird. But that is one of the benefits, I think, to having systems managed in tandem this way, where we can expect certain things based on what we saw in the other bin or bins. And when things start to deviate, then it'll, you know, it might help you track down what the cause is, or, you know, the thing that makes them different from one another, other than the symptoms, could have been the cause that you can more easily track down because of the point of reference that you get from having a similar bin to compare it to. So I don't know, that's just my thinking on having buddy bins sometimes, as far as one of the main advantages to it. Okay. I'm bumping into corn bits here too, stacking them up on the side like we did before. Still seeing no signs of the pumpkin or the cauliflower they got last time, 13 days ago. Not much of a surprise with that, right? But since we're going to go pretty generous here too with the bedding, we're going to make sure we leave ample room into which we can place it all. I guess the only thing with the other one was that I felt like I might have, I don't know, might have not given myself quite enough depth, because it felt like the food was floating very close to the surface in the other one. Not that it's a problem, because most of these composting worms are surface feeders, since the stuff that they feed on is all decaying matter that's generally found out on the surface of the earth, versus the types of earthworms that you just find in your backyard dirt. Might not be composting worms, they might just be regular earthworms. And I believe that their main thing is to be down deeper in the soil, because they're more interested in like minerals and I don't know, stuff like that. Definitely no expert when it comes to those sort of things, but once again I was attempting to make sure I'm not dropping any little worms into this big box of prepared bedding. Not that it would be a problem for the worm, I'm sure they'd be thrilled to be in this big spacious environment with all this territory to explore. But I guess I just feel like if I were to be visiting in on a different type of worm bin the next time around, then I wouldn't want to be introducing other species, since I do have, you know, these are European night crawlers. My other systems might have African night crawlers in them, or red wigglers, whatever the case may be. I do like to sort of keep my worm breeds separated, although I don't do so in such a way that I can guarantee in any way what's in any of my bins. I do sometimes feel like maybe worms are jumping ship and ending up on a lower rung of the, not rung, shelf of my shelving system. Might be dropping out of one system, ending up in another one. So sometimes I really do wonder if the worms that I've got are really what I think they are. Okay. Not bad. Let's get the feeding in there. Okay, just dump it all in, I suppose. Yeah, this is a pretty good chunk of stuff. Some of this stuff was already kind of spoiling, and it was damp because of that, and once it went in the freezer, it all just stuck together. So I want to just be able to break it apart a little bit. I believe that the majority of what I'm feeding here is stuff that was contributed by my mom. The banana peels are just from here, stuff that I ate, but the rest of this stuff, this thing is a collection of things that my mom, I guess, found in her fridge and had gone bad before it could be eaten. So, like we did in the other bin, we're treating the feeding with some of this grit to aid in the digestion of the stuff once the worms get busy nibbling away at it. I think here again we're sort of dropping a bunch of material full of worms right onto frozen stuff. But I don't know, I try not to sweat it too much. I assume that the worms are wily enough to fend for themselves in such situations. I always get this image in my mind, though, that scene from the Christmas Story, I think it's called, where the kid sticks his tongue onto the lamp post out in the freezing weather and sticks to it because of the dampness on his tongue. immediately freezes to the lamppost and he's stuck there. I don't know. That must be the image most people get in their minds when they're applying cold foods to their, or frozen foods to their worm bins. And, you know, they're just a little concerned about how that frozen material could affect the poor wormies nearby. I never even gave it much of a thought until viewers started making comments about that on my videos. So here too, I'm seeing a good amount of moisture down low. So it is a good thing that we're aerating it. But even though it's fairly damp and clumping together considerably, perhaps the best telltale is just the number of worms throughout this stuff. And once again, I guess the concern might just be a figment of my imagination. There's probably no real reason for concern. But it probably is a good idea that we're adding a good bit of somewhat dry material as a top covering with all those leaves we're going to sprinkle across the top, and then that piece of dry newspaper we're going to put on the top as well. All of those things, I believe, will contribute to the absorption of some of the moisture that's present in here. And even the yeah, I mean, like I said, this stuff is dampened pretty thoroughly, but it still probably has the potential to also absorb a little bit of moisture into itself. I usually don't sweat it as far as keeping bins a little bit more damp in the early stages of their life cycles, but as they get a little bit older, I really want to see that the material flows a lot more freely. It is a lot more crumbly, but for now I think we're going to be in good shape here with these little guys. Let's just make sure we're not taking any of them for a ride on my glove. Perhaps I could use a handful of these leaves to scrape off some of this casting material and some of the worms. Yeah, at this point this hand is going to need a good wash too. I usually attempt to keep my ungloved hand free of any filth so that I can use it to manage my camera, so that I can keep things clean, keep the clean side clean, keep the dirty side dirty. But there too, I don't go overboard on trying to do that. Sometimes I get a little messy, but it's fun. So that's it. Our check-in with these European night crawlers is complete. Oh, here we go. I think these are even signs of some of that. Is that what it is? No, this might be paper. I thought it might have just been some of the residual leftovers of some of that weird mold stuff that had been growing in these bins in the early days. But I think that's what some of these marks on the side of the container are here and there. Some of the signs of that stuff that had been in here once upon a time. So we're done here. I'm going to go get stuff cleaned up and put away. But I'm not going to waste your time with that. That stuff's really boring. But before I go, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to tell me a quick thumbs up before you go. It's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.